Gente, mas esse helicóptero tá de brincadeira com a minha cara, viu? But I really want to... What the fuck? Well, hello there, welcome back. Today I am here to talk to you about a few Brazilian books that have been translated into English. This is not necessarily a recommendations video. I wasn't the biggest fan of a few of these books, but these are all Brazilian books that I know have been translated and that I have read already, and I wanted to talk to you about them since Latinx Heritage Month is coming up and maybe you would want a Brazilian book to pick up. I tried to get to the translated version of all of these. You know, most of my August was spent reading some of these translations, but I wasn't able to get to all of them. I think there's a couple here that I wasn't able to read the translated version, so I will point it out when the time comes, but yeah, I just wanted to leave this warning, I guess. But yeah, without further ado, let's just get into the books. The first book is The Invisible Life of Eurídice Gusmão by Marta Batalha. This is about women, but specifically about women whose lives were made invisible due to the patriarchy. It focuses on Eurídice Gusmão, who was a housewife in the 1950s, I believe, maybe 60s. It talks about her and her life and the things that she had to give up, you know, because of the patriarchy, but also about women who were connected to her in one way or another, so her neighbours and her sister and her mother and all that. So it's quite a curious book. No, not curious. I think that's not the word I'm looking for. It's quite an interesting book because everything that it decides to tell you, and even the things that it explicitly decides not to tell you, like it decides not to tell you about certain women and it says so, all of that says something about how these women were perceived back in the day. For example, hi, Editing Bella here. I just realized that what I said here didn't make any sense whatsoever, so I'm here to explain. The example that I mentioned here was when they were talking about Eurídice's maid, and let's suppose her name was Maria, and they said something along the lines of, but Maria's life was insignificant, so we're not going to dwell too much on it, we're not going to talk about her much. And how I took that as basically a commentary on how the lives of women who were like Maria didn't mean anything back then, you know. That was my reading of the text. I don't know if that was Marta Batalha's intentions, you know, but that was how I read it, so I just wanted to mention that. I took that as kind of a commentary on how even when we are talking about women, we kind of forget about a few women, you know. We kind of don't talk about... Does that make sense? I think you understood what I'm saying. The voice of the narrator in this reminded me a tiny bit of Jane Austen in the sense that it is third person and it is quite removed from the story, you know. It's kind of like a person is telling you a story that didn't happen to them or anyone they actually knew. But it was quite interesting because it let you know what all of these different characters were thinking, regardless of whether or not they were right, you know, in the way they were thinking. This is basically about the forgotten lives of women who came before us. But it does focus quite a bit on Eurídice and her sister Guida. And they are both daughters of Portuguese immigrants in Brazil, and they are both white, so just be aware of that. This was quite an interesting read for me, and I actually quite liked the translation, and I also quite liked that the narration was a bit snarky, kind of. It was very funny, very humorous, even though it was talking about so many touchy subjects. I would classify this as literary fiction, and I have a hard time rating books, in case you haven't noticed by now, but I think this might have been either a 3 or a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then we have The House in Smyrna by Tatiana Salin-Levy. This is a hard book to explain. Like, it is about so many things, but at the same time, it's not really about any of them. Like, it doesn't really follow one specific story. This is not a plot-heavy book. This is more an exploration of grief. And how do I explain this? This reads almost like a stream of consciousness thing, and it's beautifully written. This was my second time reading this book, and I remember the first time I read it, I absolutely hated it. But this time, I really loved it. I don't know, maybe it's because I was expecting something different the first time. Because this book, the synopsis of it is that this woman is gifted a key by her grandfather. Her grandfather is a Turkish immigrant in Brazil, and this key basically opens the door to his old house, in Turkey. And she goes on this journey, to Turkey to kind of like find her roots and to find this house. And it is about that, but it also isn't really. In this book, we follow many things that connect back to this main character, this woman. This follows the main character's grandfather, who was a Turkish immigrant in Brazil, as I said before, and it follows her mother, who was a militant during the military dictatorship in Brazil and then was exiled to Portugal, which was where the main character was born. But it also follows the main character in an abusive relationship, and also her dealing with her mother's illness and subsequent death due to this illness. And we also follow the main character going to Smyrna in Turkey to kind of find out more about this house and her family and her roots, and then going to Portugal for the same reason, because she was born in Portugal. But this is also about intergenerational trauma and how we carry things from the people who came before us, and how even though we are our own people, we are also the sum of everyone who came before. It's about all of these things, but it's also just an exploration of grief and depression and many things, You see, it's about many things, but at the same time, it's about nothing at all. It isn't really written in a linear fashion, It is kind of like all of the stories are intertwined and they pop up, bits and pieces of them pop up one after the other in no particular order, if that makes sense. I personally really loved it. I thought it was beautifully written, and I loved the translation of this one. I would definitely rate it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book is Where We Go From Here by Lucas Rocha. This follows 3 young gay Brazilian men who each had their lives affected by HIV in one way or another. One of them has been living with HIV for 3 years, the other has just found out that he has HIV, and the third one has just gotten the negative results back to his test, but he is romantically involved with someone who is HIV positive. And this follows the 3 of them. They are all connected, but it's also about getting rid of the prejudices that we have, the society put in us regarding HIV. And this one is very young, it's not young adult because the characters have 18 and one of them has like 21, I think. But it reads very young, and it reads very exposition heavy, I guess. But I think this might read particularly interesting to non-Brazilian readers, because then you can see how HIV treatment works in Brazil, where it is public, it's free for everyone. And it is actually one of the most well-regarded HIV treatments in the world. That was a very nice thing. My thing with this book is that I didn't like one of the 3 main characters, and I didn't like the relationship he was involved in. So that definitely pushed the book down for me a bit. But the other 2 characters I really liked, and I really felt for them. So yeah, this was overall a good book, and I gave it 3 3 out of 5 stars. And then we have Perfect Days by Rafael Montes, and this book was so fucked up. Like, really, it was very fucked up. This is kind of like a darker version of You, you know, the TV show with the Gossip Girl guy. It's kind of like a darker version of that. This is told from the point of view of this guy who becomes obsessed with a woman that he just met. And he goes to great lengths to make this relationship happen. This is very dark and very fucked up, and to the end, you know, there is no point where the woman actually wants to be in a relationship with him, and the end is very hopeless, so be aware of that. And also, I'm gonna leave trigger warnings and content warnings for all of these in the description down below, but I am terrified that I might be forgetting any specific triggers, or that I might know that certain things can be triggering. So if you want to know if any of these books have a specific content or trigger, please feel free to ask me either in the comments down below, or you can just DM me on Twitter, you know, I will answer you, no problem. Well, I'm just noticing that most of these are quite dark books, and this was not intentional at all. This was just a very weird coincidence. But yeah, Perfect Days. I loved it. I was disgusted throughout this entire book. It felt so real. Like, it was hard to get through this book. If you like being weirded out and creeped out and disgusted, or if you just like very creepy reads, pick this one up, I guess. And if you liked You by Caroline Kepnes, this is similar to that, but much more fucked up. So be aware of that. And I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. And now we have Crow Blue by Adriana Lisboa. This is another one of those that is about many things at the same time, but this is less stream of consciousness than The House in Smyrna. This is more like, there is kind of a narrative, but it's again not really a plot-driven book. This is about this girl called Vanja, and she was born in the US to a Brazilian mother, but she was actually raised in Brazil. But after her mother dies of cancer, she decides that she wants to go to the US to look for her father, and she stays with her stepdad over there. And it's basically about her and this stepdad forming a relationship, you know, in getting closer to each other. Not a relationship as in a romantic relationship, just a relationship, a human relationship. I just said relationship way too many times. But yeah, it's about her and the relationship between the two of them. But it's also about him and his past as a guerrilla during the military dictatorship in Brazil. It deals with themes that are common to Latin Americans in general, but also with things that are so intrinsically Brazilian. Like, it talks about the experience of being an immigrant, and it talks about the Latinx communities, immigrant communities, and the US, and it talks about Brazil and many common thoughts of Brazilians that are not flattering, to say the least. Like, for example, how Brazilians in general try to distance themselves from Latin America in order to try to get closer to North Americans and Europeans, but also the whole process of trying to learn the way people actually speak in a different language, you know, because when we are learning a new language, we typically learn everything very proper and not in the way that people actually speak. So, you know, the whole thing of learning a new language, the way people actually talk. I remember this specific part where the main character is talking about how she knew most things in both English and Portuguese, but there were a few things that in her head were only English and a few things that were only Portuguese. Like, you start learning new words in your second language, and they exist in your head only in that language. That was quite an interesting thing to read about, because it's so real, you know. The writing in this was absolutely beautiful and I really loved it. But I did see a lot of non-Brazilians saying that they didn't understand how Fernando, the stepfather's story as a guerrilla connected to Vanja. For me, that sounds a bit ethnocentric, you know, because the things that happen in our past influence our lives, you know, we are influenced by them. And Brazil's military dictatorship ended only 35 years ago, and our country and our population are influenced and suffer from consequences of that to this day. Like, our politics suffers the consequences of that to this day. Our democracy as well. I do understand that if you are looking at these two stories only as two stories, it is gonna feel detached, but it's more about what's written between the lines and how all of the things that happened in the past have consequences to this day, and how there are remnants of that in the ways that we think to this day. So I think the connection is more in the subtext than necessarily, you know, a direct plot correlation, if that makes sense. Again, not a very plot-driven book. In the end, I really loved this book, and it would have been a 5 stars if it wasn't for the fact that there is some very problematic language at times, so definitely be aware of that, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next one is a graphic novel, and it is Daytripper by Fábio Bá and Gabriel Moon, or Fábio Moon and Gabriel Bá. It's here, it's this one. This is about this man called Brás, and he's trying to make it as a writer, but he lives in the shadow of his father, who is a very well-known and well-regarded writer. And he also works writing obituaries, I think is how you call it. It's the thingies in the newspaper that talk about people who died recently. This is his story, but it's also an exploration of the moments in our lives that define us. So it talks about the defining moments of Brás's life and what it would be like if he died after each of them. So it's a bit trippy, you know. I mean, the title is Daytripper, so it's so intriguing. This is very intriguing, and I really love the art as well. I think this is absolutely fantastic and I highly recommend it, and this was a 5 out of 5 stars for me. So that concludes the ones that I was able to read the translated versions of. The next ones I'm going to talk about were also translated to English. So I read the original version in Brazilian Portuguese, but I was unable to get to the translated English version. The first one is Symphony in White, also by Adriana Lisboa. This is one of my favorite books ever. Like, for real, this is one of my favorite books ever. This is very heavy and hard-hitting, but it's also written very beautifully. This follows two sisters who grew up in this very rural, I think is the word, like the countryside of Brazil. And it talks about their lives and why it is that when they become adults, they don't really have any contact with each other anymore. It follows two timelines. One of them is when they were younger and they lived together with their parents, and the other one is the current day timeline, and it follows the two of them as adults, and they haven't seen each other since the death of their father. So you spend the entire book trying to find out what happened and what drove the two of them apart, but also what really happened in regards to the father's death. This is absolutely incredible, one of my favorite books ever, 5 out of 5 stars, but bear in mind that it deals with some very heavy topics. And the last one that I want to talk about is The Unedited Diaries of Carolina Maria de Jesus by Carolina Maria de Jesus. For this one, I think it is better for me to read the synopsis because I think it describes it so well, so I'm just gonna read it to you now. Carolina Maria de Jesus' book, Quarto de Despejo, The Trash Room, depicted the harsh life of the slums, but it also spoke of the author's pride in her blackness, her high moral standards, and her patriotism. More than 1 million copies of her diary are believed to have been sold worldwide. Yet many Brazilians refuse to believe that someone like De Jesus could have written such a diary, with its complicated words, some of them misused, and often lyrical phrasing as she discussed world events. Doubters preferred to believe the book was either written by Audálio Dantas, the enterprising newspaper reporter who discovered her, or that Dantas rewrote it so substantially that her book is a fraud. With the cooperation of De Jesus' daughter, recent research shows that although Dantas deleted considerable portions of the diary, as well as a second one, every word was De Jesus's. But Dantas did create a different Carolina from the woman who coped with her harsh life by putting things down on paper. This book sets the record straight by providing detailed translations of De Jesus's unedited diaries and explains why Brazilian elites were motivated to obscure her true personality and present her as something she was not. It is not only about the writer, but about Brazil as recorded by her sarcastic pen. The diary entries in this book span from 1958 to 1966, 5 years beyond text previously known to exist. They show Jesus as she was, preserving her Joycean stream of consciousness language and her pithy? I don't know what that word means. Pithy. Well, and her pithy characterizations. I read this book a few years ago when I was working as a researcher for my university, and it was absolutely amazing. You know, I read the original text in Brazilian Portuguese, and from the description of this book, you know, of this translated version, says on Amazon, apparently they kept the translation as close as possible to Jesus's original writing, which had every now and then a few grammatical errors, and, you know, a few words were misspelled, and sometimes she uses words in wrong. She used them thinking they meant something when actually they meant something else. And the text that I read was the preserved version, you know, with all of the things that she got wrong, grammatically speaking. And apparently this English version kept things that way. So that's very interesting. I would like to read the translated version to see how they went about that, you know. This is a very important and poignant book. This is basically her journals, you know, as a black woman living in the Brazilian slums, and she had kids and she had to find a way to get food on their plates, but she also wanted to become a writer, which she did. It's such a great book, such an important book, and I really recommend it. So check it out. I know of a few other Brazilian books that have been translated into English, and also a few books by Brazilian authors that were written in English, and I really want to talk about them, but I haven't read them yet. I really want to get to them as soon as possible, possibly during Latinx Heritage Month, but I'm not sure. Because I haven't read these, I don't really know what they are about, so I can't really tell you that, but I really wanted to mention them anyway, in case you wanted some more recommendations, and you can look them up for yourself and see if they interest you. We have The Air You Breathe by Francis de Pontes Peebles, Idlewild by Eurídice, Blood Drenched Beard by Daniel Galera, and The Worst Best Man by Mia Souza. Mia Souza is actually half Brazilian, did you know that? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and that maybe one of these recommendations tickled your fancy, and I really hope that you decide to give a Brazilian author a chance during Latinx Heritage Month. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, comment and subscribe if you feel like it, and as always, I'll see you around.